Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the University of Birmingham. And as in the previous weeks, I'm joined by the two mentors, by James and by Matthew. And what we're going to do in this session, live and as live as they come, we're going to work through some of the questions that you've asked for further discussion on, further explanation on. And we're broadly going to divide it into themes. So if you've been asking questions, we're not taking them in the order they were posed. It'll be thematically dealt with. And in response to some of the feedback we've had, we're going to look, first of all, at some of the technological issues. What's the first question then, James?
Well, if we go with the first one up there, I suppose. At the end of the First World War...
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the University of Birmingham. And as in the previous weeks, I'm joined by the two mentors, by James and by Matthew. And what we're going to do...
I'll try that again, everybody. Our first question then. At the end of the First World War, which aircraft epitomises the technological development of aircraft during the period? Peter, what do you think?
Two aircraft for me, really, for this period specifically. The first of those is the Sopwith Camel, and I would turn around and say that that epitomises the whole thing, not least, and again, this reflects many of the comments that we've had through the posts. That, of course, was the aeroplane that Biggles flew. It was one of the first-rate fighters at the time in competition with the SE-5A, but that reached about as good as technology was going to give us for the time. The other aeroplane that particularly appeals to me is the RE-8, and again, that features in all of the literature, used primarily for close observation spotting and for working with the artillery. So very much a workhorse of air-land operation.
Have you got any thoughts, Matt?
I have to agree with Peter for the reasons that he gave. I don't think you can get much better than the two he's mentioned.
If I could be bold, and I will be, I'll take one on. Moving the focus in an international sense, looking at German air power, and this has been mentioned on the board a few times. By the time you get to 1918, the German Junker J1 in service, this being the first all-metal monoplane ground attack aircraft. And I'm less interested in the tech, I'm much more interested in how the aircraft is being used and the role that comes along with that. And of course, from about 1917 onwards, ground attack is becoming an increasingly important role for aircraft on the Western Front and in other theatres, particularly over, with T. Lawrence Arabia over in the desert. And obviously, as the tech shifts and improves and changes and these roles develop, you need aircraft like the Junkers J1
Absolutely.
and armoured ground attack or stressed. Is it a stress-skinned plane as well?
Yeah.
Anyway, so it's I think by the end of the war, you're seeing at the beginning you've moved a very, very long way, and it's, as we say at the beginning of the call, it's this white heat of conflict moves things on.
I think there's an interesting question that goes beyond that. And if the war had continued through to 1919, as many people expected it to, and the independent force had got up and running, that the Germans had continued their Gotha and Géant raids over London, I think we would have been including some of the big bombers in that list.
Yeah, we've got the Vickers Vimy coming in towards, that's in service in 1919, isn't it? Large, reliable multi-engined aircraft with a gigantic range, and no, I absolutely agree with you. It's the same with the land war as well, isn't it? And there's a temptation to divorce, because we are focusing on aviation, to divorce that from the wider context. And Plan 1919, Jesse Fuller's very famous plan from the First World War in terms of what the British Army were going to be doing, that is based around new tech, particularly
absolutely.
Those heavy. I'm not a tank expert. Anybody on the tank? No. But anyway, there's a giant heavy tank that he's very keen on using. Anyway. Moving us on, we've had a question coming actually from FutureLearn. And it was relating to it was a general comment about the focus of the course, really, relating to our focus on land-based air power. And there was a comment relating to the importance of flying boats during the First World War, and obviously linked, to wider naval aviation. Have we got any thoughts on the technical angle of aviation over the seas?
over the seas and in the seas, and for that matter, under the seas, because of course the submarine threat was growing, unrestricted submarine warfare. And these themes are mirrored in the Second World War, so it's very relevant. The focus on the land-based side of it has been, as much as anything, a question of capacity.
Yeah, of course.
There were plenty of developments, though, on the naval side of it, and the Royal Naval Air Service was active, obviously, throughout the war through till 1918. The development of carrier-borne aviation, the development of aeroplanes able to be catapulted off merchantmen and off decks, and then to land on floats and so forth, was all developing. And of course, when you go into the interwar period, those developments are continued all the way through with the big flying boats, big clippers, and a lot of the air routes were pioneered with flying boats.
I think that's a really interesting comment. I think that one of the really, really important things to come out of naval aviation during the First World War, and this is a case made by an American historian, John J. Abbiatello, got his PhD from King's, is that naval aviation actually during the First World War makes its biggest impact in the anti-submarine role. And we're not even talking there about heavier than aircraft, we're actually talking about semi-rigid airships. And they have the tactical flexibility, they've got the range and the endurance to patrol over vast amounts of seas, doing that day in, day out slogging work that Coastal Command comes to do during the Second World War. Yeah, so that was a really interesting one. We'd also had a question come through, which I am unable to see at the moment, relating to the, it's a really technical question, relating to the, is that? If you go up one, if you go up again, no, up again. There we go. We were talking about Paul. This is from Paul, and he asks us a question relating to. He could tell that enemy bombers were flying overhead during the Second World War. He was a young boy during the conflict, because he could tell by the sound their engines makes, because their engines were out of sync, and apparently British aircraft or Allied aircraft always had their engines in sync. And this is a really techy question, but let's do it. Does anyone know why the Germans operated their aircraft with engines out of sync during bombing raids over England? I bet Pete Gray knows.
Well, it's an interesting question, and it's directly related to some of the stuff that we've been talking about this week and the way that technology continues to develop over the interwar years. And whilst Trenchard was very keen to say the best form of defence is offence, the UK still maintained a technological development in means of detecting aeroplanes inbound. They had to. The experience of the First World War and of the bombing of London showed that this was a political and a media priority. And you know that from the research you did in your own PhD, James. Yeah. And one of the things that they looked at, along with the Royal Observer Corps and so forth, were huge cast concrete sound mirrors. And the idea was that this huge mirror would pick up the sound and focus it down to some chap sitting with a deck chair and a pair of earphones. It sounds ridiculous now, but they did a lot of experiments on it. And on various staff visits, we showed them to the Germans. And the Germans thought that having the engines out of sync would baffle the sound mirrors.
Wow.
It's one of those questions that the answer is almost more bizarre than the question is. But it's certainly very, very distinctive. And if you hear twin-engined aeroplanes, three-engined aeroplanes, any of them these days that are out of sync, it's absolutely unmistakable because it goes wow, wow. And if you can imagine that with a whole flotilla of German bombers over London and the dark, it's a very, very distinctive sound.
That very much reminds me of the scene from Dad's Army where you have Wilson and Pike making their different German and British engine sounds.
Don't tell them your name, Pike.
Yeah. To throw a question over to Matt, which has just come in over the thing. And I know you've addressed this a few times on the board, Matt, but it's asking about when did useful radio equipment, when did radio equipment become useful in aviation?
It depends on what you mean by aviation and what you expect the aviation to do. We have the use of wireless telegraphy in artillery spotting, but this is only really practical because the aircraft are behind the lines spotting for the artillery in a static trench war. The size of the radios negate them being used in terms of reconnaissance or for calling in further strikes from aircraft in aerodromes behind friendly lines. So is that just the sheer weight then? So if you've got such a heavy piece of equipment, you're not going to survive over the front lines because your aircraft is unmaneuverable and too slow. It's weight, but as you say, it comes down to speed. It comes down to range as well. It's all comes back to the wider context of how useful is it to have this, and how much do you gain or do you not gain through using it. And it's not until 1918 that we can see the smaller radios being used, and that we can start to see what we see in terms of aviation using the radio to a great degree over enemy lines.
So what are they doing prior to 1918 then? Is it sort of as fairly low tech as it may appear, with signals from the air, or what's, because I know you've done a lot of work on artillery cooperation. There's a key element there, isn't there, to be able to get your message down from the skies, your fall of shot is off. You need to. It's
wireless telegraphy, a one-way receiver in the aircraft that reports back to the battery commander as to where the shot is falling in relation to the target. It has been mentioned on the forums before about the clock code system, where the target is placed in the middle of a clock face, and the numbers on the clock, 12 being north, 6 being south, and different ranges of 100 yards are used to indicate to the battery where their shot is falling in relation to the target.
Because things do become increasingly sophisticated. I remember seeing, I can't know if it's in the official histories, there's a famous story of when they're beginning with artillery observation. There's famous radio messages along the lines of aim lower than the O on the ordnance survey map that you've got, because it's very, very imprecise, isn't it? And the technology evolves so quickly.
It is, and it's because the technology evolves so quickly that they have to find a way of clarifying this, but also having something that can be used across the board by everybody, so that the ideas can be transferred from unit to unit and they're using the same system, and so that people can be trained. It's also interesting to note that a lot of the artillery observation aircraft and the pilots in them will spend time with the artillery batteries that they're observing for, and we can see that the increase in the work that they can do and their accuracy and their ability to work together improves markedly through this. And it's also demonstrated by the fact that when other batteries and aircraft and pilots who are unfriendly work together, the results do drop off significantly.
Wow.
I think it's worth putting into context on this discussion that when the guys use the expression wireless telegraphy, what you're effectively talking about is very simple Morse code. So there's somebody sitting in the aeroplane going did-it-ar, did-dar, did-ar, and so forth, on a prearranged system of codes. It's much later on that you start getting high frequency, the sort of stuff, the World Service and stuff like that, those sort of frequencies. The very high frequency and ultra high frequency that we're very used to today and we take for granted is another 20 or 30 years away. But the need to be able to communicate by some method other than landing next to the battery you're servicing, and that was done on many occasions, different ground to air, basically pieces of linen, pieces of colored cloth, tarpaulin, laid out on the ground to send messages, lots of different ways of doing it. And we see this in many, many conflicts through to and including the likes of Vietnam. It's
quite interesting because at times there's almost an overemphasis on the importance of communication. And this comes out of some work that one of my MA students has been doing, examining the role of air power and air tank cooperation during the First World War. And there's a fixation amongst people that are interested and historians that the reason that this doesn't work well is because tanks and aircraft can't communicate with each other. And Derek, my student, when he sort of probed into this and looked into the record, it appeared that communication was not always the big issue. You didn't always need the high-tech solution to get the job done. It was quite okay to throw a canister over the side with a note in it you're advancing too far ahead, you need to move your thing. You know, it's I think technology is a really, really important facet of the study of airplane. You know, it's an inherently technical subject, but we've got to be really mindful, overemphasizing its importance. Well, at least for my mind.
Yes, absolutely.
Saying that, I'll stick with the technology theme if that's okay. We had a really, really interesting question come in about factors contributing to the superiority of an aircraft. What facets of aircraft performance in particular become important during the First World War? You know, how does this change and evolve? And
it depends on what the airplane is going to be used for, and it's the same. It's the same now. If you start looking through the aviation literature on which particular fourth generation fighter, Typhoon, F-15, F-16, F-18, and the Russian equivalents, what characteristics does it need? And it was the same with the aircraft during the First World War. And what you end up with is a blend between power, between aerodynamics and therefore maneuverability, weapons performance and weapons carrying performance. And throughout each of these, if you take them as vectors, they're all in tension and there are all trade-offs in every bit that you look at. I need something that's going to be more powerful, and I need to be able to get to height, to be able to get the height advantage over the enemy. I need to be able to get into the sun, to be able to look down and deny him that tactical advantage. Therefore, I need a lighter aeroplane. I need a more powerful engine. But when I get into close range on him, I need to be able to shoot at him. So I'm going to have to put guns in there. And each of these things is a trade-off as they go through. One of the other things on the negative balance side of it, you need an airplane that is stable, but only stable enough. If you end up sitting like an RE-8 plodding along and the German Albatross comes in, you're a sitting duck. You need some form of maneuverability. But what they found in the early years of the war was that this maneuverability would get you into serious trouble. And if you ended up trying to stall turn or something like that, and you got it wrong, and you ended up spinning, and spinning for many years was not particularly well understood, then that was it. You were going to hit the ground and you would probably be killed. So the ability of an aeroplane to withstand those sort of tendencies is really important. So it's these trade-offs that are important all the way through. What you see through the interwar years is almost a multi-role combat aeroplane, whereas the bombers look like what we would consider to be fighters. They're not that heavy. We're still a long way off from things like the Manchester and the Lancaster. But of course, if you're going to be flying up and down the trenches and you're going to be dropping bombs on the opponent's trench lines, you need some form of protection as well. And once you start, if you imagine some of the helicopters operating in Afghanistan, you'd actually quite like to be sitting in a bit of armor plating while you're doing that. And I think the final factor on that side of it is a degree of resilience. And if you are hit, if you're hit by ground fire, if you're hit by air-to-air fire, you want an aeroplane that's reasonably rugged. But with that ruggedness comes a weight penalty. There's various, we talked today about blue on blue, but when the Royal Flying Corps encountered their first British soldiers in France in 1914, they commented that they were now going to be fired at by the British as well as the French, as well as the Germans, and weren't particularly looking forward to the prospect. So that's where we go on aircraft performance.
I think just to sort of add on there that it might seem like an obvious point, but performance issues are an integral part of the development of aircraft from the very beginning. When you do go into the First World War, the British, because they're so short of aircraft, I'm talking particularly the Royal Flying Corps, they actually get a lot of money out and they go and buy up all the stocks of private aircraft in the UK that they can find, and they'll make do with anything. But when you probe into the role of someone like Sir David Henderson or Frederick Sykes at in the origins of the Royal Flying Corps, and I'm talking prior to 1914 here, there were a series of aircraft competitions commissioned by the British Army, the War Office, And David Henderson in particular has a really, really important role to play there in putting the specifications together for those. And it links back to one of your points, about stability. Stability is considered to be a really, really important thing here. And you can criticize David Henderson quite a bit. I'm a huge fan of his, in fact, but there are a couple of points that he can be criticized on. One is he's very keen not to let engines get too powerful, and he's very keen to restrict the size of those. He's an intelligence officer. His background is intelligence and reconnaissance, so it's all about that. He wants a lightweight aircraft that can fly in, do its job, and fly home. A lightweight, reliable aircraft. And the second thing is the stability issues you touched upon, Pete. For him, he doesn't want the aircraft to be jinking all over the skies. And at this point, aircraft are doing that because the technology is so new. And this is why we started our discussion with the Wrights. That's one of the really, really important things the Wrights do, is they do a lot of important work in terms of controllable flight. But at that point, it's still stability is a key issue, particularly to get a stable observation platform to be able to do what you're doing. And it's quite interesting that when you look into the records relating to the Fokker scourge, and apparently the BAF are losing, an awful lot of aircraft at that point. If you dig into the records, they're not really losing that many aircraft. And the BE-2C and later variations can do a fairly decent job of defending themselves against the Iron Decker. And there's a very, very famous instance of Sholto Douglas, who was who during the Second World War headed up Fighter Command, eventually reaching the top rank in the RAF. And there's a very famous story of him being attacked. I think it's actually by Immelman, and actually surviving the experience and being able to use a stable aircraft to fend off attacks from what is sort of what's considered to be the premier hunting aircraft at that time. And my research doesn't necessarily indicate that to be the case.
I think there's an interesting underlying point in all of this that we really need to keep in our minds all the time that we're talking about air power, is that there's more to life than just flying the aeroplane. You have to operate a weapon system or a military system. So if you're spending all of your time physically flying an aeroplane that doesn't want to be flown in a straight line, and you're fighting that aeroplane all the way through, you're not going to be able to do much in the way of operating the platform. And that's a really important point. What else have we got?
We've got, well, it's not really a question, it's just more of an observation that's come up. And it's a discussion that Matt's been involved a lot in. And it relates to technology and the way that technological leads leapfrog from one side to the other during the conflict. And I wondered if you wanted just to sort of talk a wee bit about that, maybe starting. Well,
go ahead, Matt.
Well, what we've got to bear in mind throughout the First World War is that each side is trying to essentially, as James said, leapfrog each other. And as one piece of technology or one new innovation is rolled out and is seen, the other side will look to counter it, and then will look to improve upon it in order to gain the advantage. And this is an almost continual struggle between the German and the British Air Forces throughout the whole of the First World War.
And the French and the American,
yes,
and the Russian and the whatever else. And I think there's an underlying point in there that brings us back to some of the myths and legends that we've discussed over the last 3 weeks, is that we get the impression, the myth is there, that these were pig-headed donkeys who were just doing the same old stuff time and time again. And yet what you've just been describing is both a struggle, and yes, it's obviously a struggle as trying to leapfrog, but it's also a process. The processes are in place, and there are people actively thinking all day, every day about how to get better and better and better. And this is very much against the stereotype.
Well, I think that links into a question that's literally just come in now. One of our watchers has noted that they're very interested in the role of science in relation to its to the development of aircraft. To what extent is innovation a result of trial and error, or is it scientific advances? And well, I think we've probably just touched upon that, but it's perhaps worth expanding on it again in that context.
My answer to that is a very glib D, all of the above. And I think in reality that's what we were seeing in the First World War and in the Second, that we need to be able to do this. We'll commission the scientific research to get us there. But other people are researching in the science world ab initio, and you get a combination of all things coming together. Do you want to enlarge on that, I think?
No, I think you've covered it fairly well there, Peter.
I mean, one thing I will add there as well is that when you dig into the archival record a little bit, the British and the French, they're the two air forces I've looked most at, are studying what the German air service are doing on the Western Front in a technological, in a scientific sense, and in a tactical sense. They're intelligent, and this just seems almost. When I read this and going into the history of the First World War, I think you normally approach it from the positions of, the lions led by donkeys. These guys are all idiots. This is a backwards war, and blah blah blah. When you actually dig into it, you realise there's actually quite sophisticated organisations and mechanisms to actually track and record and improve. And when you actually see reports, and a really, really important officer, at least with the Royal Flying Corps, is a chap called Robert Brooke Popham, commands No. 3 Squadron of the Royal Flying Corps in the pre-war period, is involved in a lot of weapons testing trials prior to the First World War, so aerial firing prior to the First World War. Eventually moves into sort of a quartermaster role for the Royal Flying Corps, and he plays such an important role in collating a lot of reports that are coming out from the front line. The Royal Flying Corps senior command are very interested in getting operational reports from their pilots, and Brooke Popham digests those and they publish those within the Royal Flying Corps. I mean, it just sounds almost unbelievable when you think about the sort of, the lions led by donkeys narrative. It's just, and perhaps at this point, it's probably a good idea to lead into that. I think if we could put the tech to one side for the time being, and we'll move on to look at what the historians say about air power and about the First World War and about the context of the period as a whole. And one of the issues that I think Pete and I touched on in our first video blog was this idea of lions led by donkeys. And does anyone want to take a stab at sort of explaining that in a fairly quick way, what that narrative, what that historical perspective is?
The standard interpretation of lions led by donkeys is that, and it effectively started with Lloyd George, and it's been rehearsed by historians ever since, was that, and for the UK viewers, the Blackadder bit of just keep throwing the troops into certain death. We're all pig-headed, we're all in our chateaus, and we don't really care. Let's just get on with it. A slightly more sophisticated version of that is, this is like schoolboy chess. We need to get rid of as many pieces on the chessboard, and then we can actually have at the king or queen. No strategy involved at all. That's the essence of it. And in terms of perceptions, that perception has lived on, and it's been rehearsed by a lot of historians. The counterbalancing is that they were all very bright, they were all intelligent, they all responded to what was happening, and so forth. There is a middle ground, which was effectively started by the British historian John Terraine when he published his book, Douglas Haig, An Educated Soldier. And what he was basically saying was, it's not that bad, come on. Other historians have demonstrated a learning curve through the First World War. Tied into that lions led by donkeys, and that's why we put it into the first week, was that Haig in particular was a dyed-in-the-wool cavalry officer, and that horses would never ever be replaced. Well, in the Second World War, the Germans relied on them heavily, but to move stuff, not necessarily as cavalry. The reality was that Haig in particular, in overseeing the writing of field service regulations, was laying down ground rules for the cooperation between aeroplanes and cavalry. In the big army maneuvers that recent research has shown, heavy use was made of the few aeroplanes that they had to get the best out of a corps level exercise against another corps. And they were able to spot maneuvers and so forth. Other historians have said, basically, if Haig had any fault on the technology side of it, it was that he was too keen to embrace it.
Absolutely. I think that's one of the central thrusts of, and the historiography on Haig, it's still divided, so we shouldn't give a false impression here that, all historians now agree that Haig's a fantastic officer. even his most dedicated, I wouldn't say most dedicated supporters, but Gary Sheffield, our colleague, and over at the University of Wolverhampton, in his biography of Haig, which came out 2011, the chief sort of really makes a very, very interesting case for Douglas Haig and his love of technology. And Gary's conclusion is that Haig's a technophile. He's too keen, as you said, and one of the best examples there being tanks at the time of the Somme. He's so keen to get them to the front. It may have been a wise opportunity there just to take a step back and just to pause and regroup and push things on. But of course, you've got to take the role of and your analysis of Haig in context. I know you've probably got something to say on this, Matt, because you've been engaged in some quite heated debates on the boards about.
Yes, I have. Not only heated, but also very enjoyable. One of the things that struck me about the debates we have is how often the first day of the Somme is brought up, and how often it is simply a tactical level numbers versus ground gained analysis. There is more to the First World War than simply the amount of ground gain versus the amount of men lost. We have to consider the higher level operational and strategic levels of war when we look at battles, when we look at offensives. To take the Somme, for example, what we have to look at is, why is the battle fought? Why is it fought? When it is fought, and why is it fought where it is fought? Now, for the Somme, it is fought to relieve the pressure on the French at Verdun. The Germans are throwing everything they have at this because they know that the French cannot afford to let Verdun fall. And so their plan is to simply bleed the French white. So we have that strategic reason.
They get very, very close.
They do get very, a lot closer than I think a lot of people realize. And then this is why we fight with the French, because we fight with the French on the Somme, because this is the natural joining point of where the two armies meet. Haig does not want to fight here. He wants to fight up in Belgium. He does not want to fight on the Somme. But as the junior partner in an alliance, he has very little option on this. And also the pressure is that intense on Verdun that something has to be done sooner rather than later. So when we look at something like the Battle of the Somme, we have to look at what does it gain in the operational and the strategic levels of war. It keeps the French in the war. There is no way in 1916 the British have got a force that is able to stop the Germans if Verdun falls and the French fall out of the war. Operationally, it removes many German soldiers. A lot of good German soldiers are sent to the Somme because it's seen as a quiet sector where they can rest, where they can train, and where things will be quieter and less dangerous for them. It also removes a lot of the junior officers of the German army. These are people that the German army rely upon due to their tactical doctrine, where the junior officer is told what the objective is, but is not told how to do it. That is for him to decide. So the cream of the junior officer corps is gone. It is very difficult and takes a long time to train and replace these men and give them the experience they need to conduct the German tactical doctrine. So as I said before, we can't just see it as a simple tactical level numbers game. We have to look at the wider reasons as to why things are fought. And to look further to the Somme is a 5-month offensive.
It's not a day, is it?
It's not a single day. Yes, the first day is an absolute tragedy, but we cannot just focus our attention on that one day alone.
I think it's really interesting here that perhaps we need to put some balance back into this. And I think you've got detractors of individuals such as Gary Sheffield who've been said they've gone too far in their defence of Haig. But I think if you actually look into Gary's work, it's fairly balanced, and Haig certainly gets some things wrong. That's not what's being said here.
No.
But I suppose this dualistic black and white donkey lion thing doesn't really play out in reality. No. And that's because for me it's a war on a scale that is we haven't seen before. There's no training for this, and bear in mind that Haig has received the best training that the British Army can give him at this point. And there are debates about the effectiveness of professional education in the British Army at this point, and there's debates about what's the use of going to staff college. But in terms of my reading of it, there are effective mechanisms for study and learning within the British Army at this point, and it actually does improve the conduct of officers when they're at the front line. Haig is able to cope with the scale of this conflict, and that's a really important thing. But of course, he still makes mistakes. To link this closer to air power, then, do we want to offer maybe some thoughts on the historical perspectives on Trenchard? For some, he's a hero, and for others, he is the quintessential donkey at the front line.
It's very instructive on people like Trenchard to go beyond the simple biographies on Trenchard, of which there aren't very many, unfortunately. But if you read Maurice Baring, who was an intelligence officer and was basically in what in modern circles would be called the outer office, he was not quite an aide-de-camp, not quite a personal staff officer, but he is fulfilling those sort of roles.
He's a PA, isn't he, almost, modern business kind of speak? Perhaps.
In business type.
Yeah.
But he is basically Trenchard's right-hand man. He keeps his diary. More importantly, he keeps notes on all of the meetings that Trenchard has. And Trenchard is out all of the time. He's talking to people on the front line. He's talking to the squadron commanders. He's talking to the pilots. He's talking to the engineers. And he's not just talking in the sort of hackneyed way of, right, I've done my listening, I can go back to the bar and have a beer. He's actually then firing off letter after letter after letter. And if you go to the National Archives at Kew, and interestingly, if you follow the American example through of the remembrances of Billy Mitchell, the same is happening. So Trenchard is sending off all these letters. We need this aeroplane improved this way. We need this set of logistics going there. And he is responding to what he hears on the front line. And that, in my view, is not donkey type behavior. He is, to be scrupulously fair, saying the best form of defense is offense. And we therefore must be going at it all the time. No respite, no empty chairs in messes, and all of the other things. But what we must also have a look at with the Trenchard side of it is that Trenchard believed fervently that the best place to fight the enemy was over the enemy's territory where he had to defend. And he would fly out, he'd send his troops out, his airplanes out, his squadrons out, to fly over the German trenches and take on the German there. Whereas the German was prepared to stay on their own side of the lines until 1917. And after the Somme and into 1917, the Germans turned around and said, Brits have got a point here. We're going to have to do the same thing. And the war in the air took a significant turn at that point. So no donkey.
No. I mean, we do have criticisms of Trenchard though. And it's okay. I mean, perhaps we should explore some of those now just to an extent. One of the criticisms, and if you trace it back in the historiography, it comes from two places. Firstly, Trenchard has a very difficult relationship with another officer within the Royal Flying Corps, Sir Frederick Sykes. I don't know whether we've got enough time to go into the full details of these disagreements, but in essence, there is a personality clash there. And these are two individuals that are striving for the top job in the Royal Flying Corps. And two individuals that actually end up getting the top job in the RAF. Trenchard first, then Sykes, and then Trenchard comes back and replaces him. When I look at the archival record on this, and you can look at Sykes's personal papers at the RAF Museum, Trenchard's personal papers are there. In their professional capacities, when they're writing to each other, and they are professional, they're not close, they're not warm. But a lot of animosity spirals out from these two individuals. And I'm not getting into a blame game. There's just no point. But at a certain point during the Second World War, I think someone like Sykes feels he's had enough, and he comes and puts his memoirs together in 1943, and is extremely critical of Trenchard and Haig in those. And then in return, you have Trenchard's biographer sort of, having a go back. But some of the criticisms that Sykes puts forward relate to the flexibility that Trenchard displays in terms of this policy of what Riley and Jones called the strategic air offensive, and this is the strategic air offensive of the First World War, which is using your fighting aircraft, as you've said, Pete, to push deep into enemy territory to secure a degree of the control of the air. The criticism, of course, comes, and Sykes's famous phrase is battering ram tactics, that, you know, there's no nuance, there's no finesse there. And at times you need to adapt and you need to change your approach. You need to be defensive at certain points. You can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again. And that's one of the major criticisms of Trenchard. And I wonder if any thoughts?
I think that's probably a fair criticism. But as historians, one of the things that we really have to get to grips with on this thing is, and we see it too often, that because we wanted to portray a, let's say, a donkey type history, we cite Sykes very, very frequently. and you see that through many history books. Sykes's reminiscences in the early 1940s, but not backed up by original archival material. So, as I say, you see a lot of that. I think it really depends, back to the old research question, what am I trying to show? Where am I going with this? Let's find the best possible evidence, not just the evidence that fits where it touches.
I think that seems very, very, very fair. I think I'll draw our sort of lines led by donkeys type thing, and we'll move it on to look at. There's been a phrase that has been needling my colleague Matt on the boards, and it's the idea of the war to end all wars. And I wondered if you'd like to explain sort of the context of where that comes from, Matt, and what's been irking you about that.
The thing that irks me about that is not so much the statement itself, but what we take it to mean today compared to what it may have meant at the end of the First World War. And this is a personal opinion, but for me, it means more of the scale and the destruction and the death that was involved in the war, not that this was a war fought to remove war from society. And that's something that when it's used today, it's used to portray an idea that this was going to be the last war that was ever fought and that we would never fight another war again. Whereas I feel that that is somewhat taking our ideas on society today and supplanting them onto 1918, 1919.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenging thing, isn't it? It's one of the key lessons that you try to drive home to undergraduate students, the importance of, when you're exploring a historical time period, you do have a gift as a historian, and it's hindsight, and you can have a look and you can explore the topic with that. But you've got to be very, very careful of judging the actions of others with evidence that they didn't possess or couldn't possess because it wasn't there at the time. And I mean sort of physical evidence, but I also mean sort of moral, ethical judgments about individuals based upon how we feel about things now. And I think you can do that as a historian. You can use historical examples. You know, the work of A.C. Grayling on the strategic bombing during the Second World War is really interesting in that regard, taking a historical case study and reflecting on it. And he's not reflecting on moral or ethical values from the past. He's reflecting on our moral ethical values now. And I think that's a really interesting thing that you can do. But you need to make the distinction and make sure you're letting people know what it is that you're using your historical case studies to demonstrate or not.
Yeah, when you're using case studies in these sorts of things, you have to be very clear that that's just what it is. It's a case study. You have to be very careful not to cherry pick from history.
Yeah.
And you have to be, there's a classic quotation of, history's a funny place, they do things differently there. As historians, we mustn't put our moral value sets on top of things that were exercised by totally different people. But it is such a challenging thing to do, isn't it? And it's sort of, sorry to use a bit of a sort of a, I don't know, it's not really a highbrow term. It's this idea of self-reflexivity. You need to be examining yourself as an individual and seeing how your values and judgments shape the way that you view evidence, because they do. Yeah. And that's why, and I get to say it on the blog today on this, you know, the quote from E.H. Carr that, you know, before you study the fact, and this is a paraphrase, before you study the facts, you need to study the historian that's putting those together for you, because we all bring baggage to the table, and the best historians are the ones that sort of acknowledge that up front, I suppose, or at least are aware of their own, you know, their own faults and their own strengths and their own, you know, their lens. Go on from that to choose a whole pile of different quotations from various historians, of which I think my favorite is that history doesn't repeat itself, historians repeat each other.
Yeah, that's
And in this debate, to finish off the lines led by Donkey Stuff, that's exactly what we see, is somebody will pick it up, somebody will run with something, and then they will cite each other, not troubling to go back to the original sources.
Yeah, it's very interesting, isn't it? You sort of have, you know, in terms of historical theory, I won't go in too deep, but you do have the sort of the first wave of history, and that's known as the traditional history. That's the first interpretation put out about an event. Then you'll have the revisionists that come along, that their job is to revise that, to revise the traditional perspective. And then you can get things known as post-revisionists who come along and they'll revise the revisionists. Yeah. And you tend to find actually that they've actually gone back to the traditional view, and they've found a new way of support. I mean, this is very, very blunt. It's much more complicated than that. But you know, there are these waves of historical scholarship, and as you say, you know, the further away you get from the event, the more tempting it is not to actually go into the archives. And that's why I think our job as historians is really important, because we do, and we've been trained to do this, you know, to sort of to dig back to the origins of an issue and find the, you know, the primary sources, if you will, you know, to actually find the original evidence.
Where are you going to take us next?
I'm going to stick with historiography if I can. Sort of historical interpretations relating to this. One of the most interesting things to have come out of the discussion boards, and it's been so great to see, is the Baldwin "bomber will always get through" quote. Yeah. And I think one of the most interesting things that we've done, and I'm really, really pleased that we have, is we've given people the opportunity to explore that sentence in the context of the original debate. Yeah. And I just thought, if you want to comment upon that wider context, and also the way that historians have sort of explored that, and, you know, perhaps getting into debates relating to appeasement and rearmament and things like that.
Yeah. Do you want to crack off, Matthew?
Well, I'd like to start by saying that we have to see this quote from this statement from Baldwin as being very much a product of its time. Quite a few of the comments that I've noticed on the board on this is that the Second World War showed this not to be true. Whilst that is the case, again, this is looking at it with hindsight. When Baldwin makes the speech in 1932, there is a limited early warning system in place in Britain. We do not have radar, and we also have bombers that are quicker and far more maneuverable than the fighters, and fighters are underarmed relative to bombers, and so therefore cannot be decisive in attack against a mass of bombers. So when Baldwin makes this statement, not only is he trying to prepare the country for rearmament and the potentials that might bring with it, but he is also speaking a modicum of truth in what he says.
Yeah, I think it follows on neatly from what James was saying earlier on about putting yourself into the position of the time. And having done some of this sort of stuff for real, not dropping bombs on people, but flying in the dead of night with no lights on, going to intercept a Russian aeroplane over the Iceland Faroes Gap with no lights on. It's pretty dark out there, to say the least. Imagine trying to float around over London with anti-aircraft fire from your own side whistling around your ears, searchlights blinding you and ruining your night vision that you just spent the last half hour trying to build up, and looking for this absolute needle in a haystack. It's hugely difficult. Were they all going to come at night? That was the experience from the First World War. But even by day, when you look at the size of the east coast of England and the ranges of the aeroplanes concerned, physically stopping them was hugely difficult. We've all seen the film The Battle of Britain, so we're all experts on the technology and all the rest of it. But radar was not even a gleam in people's eye at the time. This comes back to the sound mirrors, to Royal Observer Corps with all of their binoculars, and so forth. It was, yeah, the bomber was going to get through.
I mean, it comes through back to the experience of the First World War, and there's been some discussion on the boards, I suppose, of why we've quickly jumped to the Second World War, and and the interwars. And there's a variety of reasons. We're giving you a taste of of air power as a whole throughout a period that we're interested in. But the legacy of the First World War is profound in terms of air power, and I would argue it continues to be. Some of the experiences of the First World War continue to shape how air power practitioners view their world. And in terms of what Baldwin was saying, the experience of the First World War depending on how you perceive it, seemed to indicate that the bomber would always get through. There was no way to stop the bomber. A closer reading of the record indicates that by August 1918, the British had an air defence system that was capable of maybe not stopping the bomber, but it was capable of inflicting attrition on the enemy force that would eventually stop them from being able to do what they do. And that's the key. That's what air defence. That's what defence against a bomber force comes about. And that's precisely, why when you look at strategic bombing during the Second World War, and Arthur Harris, that figure of percentage of attrition is so important, because you can't stop the bomber coming through. If you inflict enough attrition, you can stop them coming back.
That's right. The Harris reference is interesting because, of course, Harris actually flew in the defence of London as a fighter pilot during the First World War. I think from an organisational perspective, it's interesting to look at what Stanley Baldwin was actually doing in the lead up to that particular speech. And I've mentioned it a couple of times on the boards. He was on the Committee for Imperial Defence, so effectively the non-war cabinet. He was chairman of the Coastal Defence Committee, and he was taking and listening to evidence almost week by week in the previous year. So it wasn't just his own views on whether the bomber was going to get through. He was getting a lot of expert evidence, the sort of work that these days is done by the House of Commons Select Committee on Defence. But he was doing it from a policymaker's point of view. And he was getting more and more and more convinced that the next war was going to be horrific. And we needed to face that fact. We needed to get into the position of, well, let's make sure it doesn't happen. The alternative of another trench war was equally unacceptable. But this war from the air, and he got himself wound up basically and became increasingly passionate about it, which is why his speeches as it came out. It's interesting if you read Middlemass and Barnes, who did the big biography on Stanley Baldwin.
I've put that on the comments page a few times. I think that reference you can find that on the boards. But anyway, sorry.
Yeah, and it's well worth looking at it beyond just the straight statement. One of the, I hate to use the expression on this sort of occasion, but one of the pedagogical type expressions. One of the reasons why we put the Baldwin quote in and ask for discussion on it is to bring out the fact that people so often just quote, "the bomber will always get through." And the invitation then to go and read more widely around the speech, read more the speech in total, but also the circumstances around it. I think there's some really good learning points in that.
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely fair. I've got. Well, let's have a look how we're doing for time. We're doing pretty good for time. So I will just bring us forwards to let's have a look at some organisational, operational style things. One of the questions that came on the board, I'll take it back to Trenchard if I can. Appointed Chief of the Air Staff to the Royal Air Force. The first Chief of the Air Staff is in the post for a very, very short period of time, and then resigns, which is an unprecedented thing for a Chief of the Air Staff. Well, it's obviously unprecedented at that point because he's the first. But I just wondered, we've had a few questions on the board about the circumstances of that, and perhaps it's a good opportunity to sort of talk about Trenchard in the political context a little bit, because he's a bit of a political animal, really, isn't he?
At the same time as he's saying he's the last thing in the world.
Yeah,
he's not a political animal.
Well, he very well anyway.
Well, you crack on with it.
Well, I think that's the key, isn't it? I mean, he is appointed into a post, and there's been quite a lot of talk on the comments boards about Trenchard being a supporter of the RAF and a supporter of strategic bombing during the First World War. That isn't the case. He sees the creation of the RAF as potentially getting in the way of the chief job of air power during the First World War, which is to
support the army.
Yeah, to support the army in the field. Means then start getting a little bit confused towards the end of the conflict, where he thinks the control of the air starts getting more important than supporting the army. Well, at least in my reading of it. He's persuaded, in essence, against his will, to take up the role of Chief of the Air Staff. And against his will, I'm not quite sure whether I believe him now or not. But I think Haig plays a very important role. He'd like to keep Trenchard in France if he can. But if there's going to be a new third service, he'd like his man at the top of it to make sure he's continuing to deliver air power in a way that it should be delivered. There's on the political side of things and taking over the political role as Air Minister. There's an awful lot of discussions relating to the appointment of Lord Northcliffe. Northcliffe being the media magnate, the owner of the Times, the Daily Mail, various other publications. He chafes and harasses the government throughout the First World War about issues relating to air power and air defence. Is in fact offered the job and turns it down for a variety of interesting reasons. Long and the short of it, his brother is appointed into the role, Lord Rothermere, who the Rothermere family actually continue to own newspapers to this day, including the Daily Mail. And basically, he and Trenchard are approaching their understanding of air power from absolute poles apart. And one of the main things is Trenchard is the air power expert at this point, or he certainly considers himself to be the air power expert, and he doesn't want to be taking advice from the owner of a newspaper that doesn't really know a great deal about it. And there's friction there from the off. Does that seem? Go on, Peter. Go on.
I think Rothermere would see it that Trenchard wasn't taking direction from the politicians.
Well, but this is that's the key point.
That's the key point. It's not just advice. Trenchard should be advising the minister. The minister decides.
Sorry, I was putting forward the Trenchardian view there. That he thinks he should run this department. He's there to run the whole lot.
But he's not.
Well, no. He's...
So a falling out was inevitable. But Trenchard certainly saw himself as the lead expert, and then he just wasn't going to do anything. In the event, he was put in charge of the Independent Air Force, which was. There were several factors came out of the German bombing of London. One of it was that this has to be defended.
Mm-hmm.
Might be difficult, but it has to be done. It has to be seen to be done. And we'd actually quite like it to be effective as well. The Royal Flying Corps said, we'll get the Royal Naval Air Service to do it. They do Defence of UK. Naval Air Service said, no, the Air Force have to, the Royal Flying Corps have to do it. And they passed the buck a few times. The two big reports that Lloyd George sponsored and actually chaired himself, the Smuts report, which we've discussed over the course of this week, led to the independent Air Force that we know and admire today. That was one thing to come out of the German bombing of London. The second was that we were under considerable media pressure to retaliate. We must do the same back to them, to the Germans. And we see this coming through in the Second World War as well. And Trenchard is then sent off to run this this small battle. What he does throughout most of that is, instead of going to bomb factories, which occasionally happens, instead of going to bomb cities, instead of being the architect of area bombing, he actually sends the airplanes off to enemy aerodromes, to concentrations of troops, and so forth. So he undermines its original intention, and certainly the media's original intention. He writes in his diary on the day of the armistice that it has been a colossal waste of time. So no, we do not see in 1918 Trenchard as the bomber baron.
No, it's really interesting, and I think one of the questions still to be answered for me, if anybody wants to do some research on this, is at what point does Trenchard get into the bomber camp? It for me, it really isn't clear. It's not as simple as he gets to be chief of the air staff in 1919 and then suddenly jumps on the bomber bandwagon. But I haven't really found a coherent answer to that question yet.
The trouble is that we approach that question, James, knowing the answer, or knowing what happens. So, it's like watching a soap when you actually know when such and such is going to die or have a baby or whatever else. We know that there is a huge strategic air offensive against Germany, but that is not how the bomber war is envisaged. There are certainly attacks against industry. And the Air Force thinking through to the early parts of the Second World War is on very precise anti-industry attacks, which they're not able to deliver on as it happens. But the the deeper role of interdiction, the deeper role of getting into concentrations of reserves and this sort of thing is a natural extension of what Trenchard's been doing in the First World War.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the point that David Jordan makes in his David Jordan, being a scholar at King's College, makes the point that there is a natural extension between, and not only between the interdictioning, but the strategic way that Trenchard is using his fighters, the importance of being on the attack. There is a natural line there between that and strategic bombing that the RAF eventually come to hold so dear.
So it's an evolution of thought.
Yeah.
It's superimposed, and as we move from SDSR, Strategic Defence and Security Review 2010, into the same exercise for 2015, there is an element of what can air power do that will guarantee the future of the Air Force, and that is critical to Trenchard's thinking. So he is bound to follow, rather than a limited air defence of London line of approach, he is bound to follow an offensive approach. And that was his nature anyway. So we see an evolutionary process, we see an overlaying of financial necessity, and so on. So it's a complex area.
Yeah.
What I suggest we do, we're getting close to our allotted time, is if we just have a quick flick through the questions and see what's come in.
There was one in particular that I've pulled off. I've been sort of trying to do this as we've been going. So you'll forgive me if I rustle some notes.
Were the pilots in the First World War taken from the upper classes at the beginning of the war? Certainly from the middle classes, from the public schools and so forth. But a lot of the officer cadre were. And what you saw for the Royal Flying Corps was some people being recruited straight from school or university and coming in, others being recruited from existing officers. So there is a natural tendency for that. As you get, I'll come back to you in a moment. I know you've done a lot of research on it. In fact, you crack on.
Are you sure? I just wanted to add then, it's not necessarily about class really for the Royal Flying Corps. It's about education, and it's about being the right kind of individual, and that obviously is linked to class, and the person they're most interested in is the public school recruit that's played sport, and that has a particular understanding of the world in terms of, and this is where the chivalry thing comes in, and we've discussed this on the boards, whether chivalry is real or not. But for me, it's some of the notions instilled during the public school education actually favour things relating to chivalry at that time. And just bear in mind, chivalry, you've got to understand it in the context of that time, and it is a concept tinted with sort of a social Darwinistic understanding of the world, you know. So you can be honourable and you can also stab the person in the back. It kind of makes sense. It's a natural thing to be doing. But in terms of, sorry, to get us back on point, one of the most important things is there isn't a rush for upper class pilots at the beginning of the war. There's only a limited supply of those, and attrition takes place. And of course, upper class individuals are going into the Navy and they're going to the Army. And in the Army in particular, they are being attrited. It's not a very nice word, but they are being attrited at the front at a fairly fantastic rate. And so there isn't that many of that stock to go round. So the the Royal Flying Corps starts to take people from the middle classes and even from classes beneath that. But the important thing is that they've either been to a public school or they've been to a good enough school that holds values that you could attribute to a public school.
I think you can take it a stage further, and if you just look at the way in which the demographics of the British Army Officer Corps change over the course of the First World War, and the leadership styles and models change as people are promoted from the ranks. It's not just a question of which school you went to, but as the war goes on, increasingly, it's how good are you actually as a leader in war? And quite a lot of these people do volunteer for the Royal Flying Corps. Quite a lot of them go in, first of all, as observers, and then move over and retrain as pilots. In fact, many of the senior officers that we've been talking about, when we stood in front of Lord Portal's statue outside MOD, whilst we weren't being chased by the MOD policeman, which you didn't see on camera. Portal started off as an observer. Well, he started off as a motorcycle rider, messenger. then became an observer, and then became the pilot and much decorated during the war. Many others followed that route. Are there any other questions?
I've got another one recorded down. We've not talked much about the Naval Air Service at all. I mean, we've talked about it a fair bit on the boards in terms of, you know, the inter-service rivalry between the Royal Naval Air Service and the Royal Flying Corps. And we also talked a bit at the beginning today about the importance of some naval roles in air power. A really interesting question has come in relating to the Royal Naval Air Service at Gallipoli. It's not necessarily what the Naval Air Service are doing at Gallipoli, but it's about the notion of learning, and it's about the notion of inter-theatre learning during the First World War. And this seems a really appropriate question because we've got a scholar at Birmingham, Amy Fox-Godden, who's looking at that very question in terms of the British Army during the First World War. Are the British Army learning from different theatres, and sort of extend that question into the realm of air power, as one of our viewers has done. Is there examples of inter-theatre learning? So in air power during the First World War, and you know, in the context of the British here.
It's your research area.
No, I know. Well, the reason I asked the question, because I don't be able to dodge the answer, is that this is a relatively new area. And there's not very much research being done into how inter-theatre learning has been done, which is why the work of Amy Fox-Godden is going to be so important when it comes out. And I think it's about 12 months' time that Amy's PhD will appear, perhaps less now. And it's about thinking about how the mechanisms of learning take place. The Royal Flying Corps are certainly a service that focus on the experience of learning. They are very keen to learn lessons. They are getting reports from the front. They are circulating those reports within the organisation, and they are changing technology and practice based upon those reports. In the case of Gallipoli, and it's a really interesting one because we get to talk about Sykes again, Frederick Sykes is dispatched over to Gallipoli in 1915 to investigate what the Royal Naval Air Service are doing over there. There's some suggestions they're not using air power as efficiently as they want to. He comes back and produces a report about the Gallipoli experience, and that's widely circulated within the Admiralty's Air Department and the Admiralty itself. And then that's taken on board in terms of what the Royal Naval Air Service do going forwards. But that's me dodging the question, really, because I ultimately don't know. And the answer is it's in the archives. We need to find this out. This is one of those areas where we need to look.
Yeah, there are some interesting questions underlying that. The role of Sykes is one of them. The air power that was used in Gallipoli was not particularly effective. And the main reason from that I've been able to find is that the logistics supply train, the number of different types of aeroplanes, different types of engines, the sort of things that make you shudder when you actually look at, they didn't have the spares basically to be able to operate them at anywhere near the rate that they needed. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the things that comes out very clearly from Sykes's work. I sometimes wonder whether the question of inter-theatre lessons learned and learning curves is overlain by inter-service learning curves, and the way in which things were developing for the Royal Naval Air Service and the way in which things were developing for the Royal Flying Corps were probably divergent. Is there anything you want to throw in on top of that?
Nothing more that you two have added, no.
Should I take us on one last one, or some more of them?
Let's just have one last question and then we'll call it a day at that point.
We've had a sort of a semi-post, hasn't really all come through, but it relates to the importance of education to the RAF. I think that's what the post-Renaissance wanted to know about. And I think we've talked about it on the boards quite a bit in terms of the immediate post-war period, post the First World War. Trenchard devotes an awful lot of time to investing in infrastructure, time and money, investing in infrastructure in the RAF, and part of that is an educational establishment. And I wondered if you'd like to talk a little bit about that, Peter, on that.
Basically, Trenchard has several choices open to him when he's into the early 1920s. He wants to establish the Royal Air Force as a permanent service, and the word permanent resonates through all the files. And he has a choice of, should he put the money into aeroplanes? Should he put the money into whatever else? And he decides that the best investment for the future is to put it into bricks and mortar and institutions. And that's where we come up with the, still there at Cranwell, the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell, the Cadet College. The Staff College at Andover is particularly important. And of course, the Apprentice Training School at Holton. And those key institutions and the relationships between them. I say the Staff College is important. He basically hand picks the first course and oversees the next 2 or 3. And it is very clear that the officers who attend that Staff College course are destined for greater things. They are the people who end up as the leaders in the Second World War. There are mixed views on staff colleges. Some would turn around and say they merely teach you to be a staff officer. And certainly if you look at some of the exercises that were done at Camberley by the Army in the interwar years, that's largely true. What Trenchard tried to do, and we come back to Brooke Popham again as the first commandant, was to build in a significant amount of education in terms of the intellectual development, what the modern service calls the intellectual component. And for a man who's not particularly well educated himself, given the number of times that he had to attempt examinations to get into the Army, he read extremely widely, and I think he could see the value of what they were trying to do. So I think education was recognised as being hugely important.
I think that's going to be supported as well, isn't it, by the conclusions one of your own PhD students, Ross Mahoney, who is the resident aviation historian at the RAF Museum, and Ross has sort of undertaken, well, it's almost a social history of various things relating to the RAF officer corps during the interwar years. And one of the things he pulls out being really important is the staff college education as a measure in terms of how far someone's going to go in their career. But in terms of education as well, it's really important for the Royal Flying Corps too, because the core of officers who form the Royal Flying Corps, there's a surprisingly high number of staff college trained Army officers in amongst them. They are fluent in the language of the British Army. I'm repeating myself from the blog about 2 weeks ago, but it's an important point. They're fluent in the language of the British Army, and they understand how to sell air power to interested parties. They can tell people, they don't need to frighten people with what air power, it's not going to undermine anything, it's only going to enhance what you're doing. And education is really important in that sense, and it comes back to Julian Corbett, the naval strategist, who said, what's the exact quote, Pete? Words must mean the same for all. That's a
common language to make politicians, senior officers, and operators operate on a common playing field, a level playing field.
In essence, so
a common vocabulary.
So education for me is important in establishing that common vocabulary for a group of individuals. Are we drawing things to a close then, gents? Or?
Yes, I think we'll call it a day at that point. Thank you, James. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you, Jag, for all of the extra work on the IT side of it. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for all the questions that have been coming in and for your attention during the whole of the course. Hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. What we'll be doing from here is seeing the rest of this week out. We'll be doing another blog, this time from the RAF Museum. We'll record it on Friday morning, and we'll get that posted along with our summaries and so forth. But thank you very much indeed for your interest and for your attention.